March 15, 1966. Dense jungle canopy, Quang Tri Province, South Vietnam. Captain Nguyen Van Hoa crouched behind twisted mangrove roots, studying the American patrol through morning mist. His intelligence reports had prepared him for superior firepower, advanced weaponry, overwhelming air support. What the reports never mentioned was the sound, the thunderous crashing through undergrowth that announced Marines from hundreds of meters away. Hoa weighed 104 pounds. His entire combat load, rifle, ammunition, water, and gear added barely 20 pounds more. He moved through jungle terrain like smoke, every step calculated for silence. The approaching Marines carried loads that would have crushed most Vietnamese soldiers. 120 pounds of equipment per man, M16 rifles, ammunition belts, water, radios, medical supplies. The average American Marine towered at 5 feet 8 inches, weighing 166 pounds, 62 pounds heavier than Hoa himself. The Viet Cong had been told these giants would be unstoppable. Instead, Hoa watched exhausted faces beneath heavy helmets, heard labored breathing, saw soldiers struggling with gear that made them visible targets in terrain where survival meant becoming invisible. The weight difference wasn't just physical, it was tactical, and it would change everything about how this war was fought. The jungle pressed in from all sides as Private First Class Jimmy Johnson adjusted his pack straps for the dozenth time that morning. 123 pounds of gear distributed across his 5'9" frame, 68 pounds more than he weighed when he first enlisted back in Cedar Rapids. The M16 in his hands added another 8 pounds, loaded and ready. Water sloshed in his canteens. Ammunition clinked against his belt. The PRC-25 radio on his back crackled with static every few steps, its 20-pound bulk a constant reminder of the technological advantage that was supposed to make this war easy. 200 meters ahead, Captain James Sutherland raised his fist, signaling the patrol to halt. Through the dense canopy, sunlight filtered down in scattered shafts that revealed more than concealed. Sweat poured from beneath his helmet, soaking through the camouflage fabric that clung to his shoulders. At 172 pounds, Sutherland carried the additional weight of command, maps, compass, extra ammunition for the squad, responsibility for 19 Marines whose average age was 19 years old. The captain's eyes swept the terrain ahead, searching for movement in the tangle of vines and rotting logs that characterized this section of Quang Tri Province. Intelligence reports indicated Viet Cong activity in the area, but intelligence reports had been wrong before. What concerned Sutherland more than enemy presence was the sound his patrol made moving through the jungle, branches snapping. Under the weight of overburdened Marines, equipment rattling with each step, the collective breathing of men pushed beyond their physical limits by gear designed for a different kind of warfare. Sergeant Thomas Foster wiped condensation from his rifle scope and studied the tree line. At 164 pounds, he was considered average by Marine Corps standards, though the additional 70 pounds of combat load made every step a calculated effort. The M60 machine gun across his shoulders weighed 23 pounds empty, but Foster never carried it empty. 200 rounds of 7.62 millimeter ammunition added another 14 pounds. Extra barrels, cleaning kits, and spare parts brought his total load to over 140 pounds. The mathematics of modern warfare had seemed simple back at Camp Pendleton. Superior firepower, advanced communications, overwhelming logistical support, these advantages would crush any enemy foolish enough to stand against American military might. The reality of dense jungle terrain told a different story. Every piece of equipment that provided tactical advantage also created tactical liability. The radios that connected them to artillery support announced their position to anyone within listening range. The body armor that stopped rifle bullets made movement through thick vegetation a wrestling match with every vine and branch. The ammunition that ensured sustained firepower added pounds that accumulated with each kilometer of patrol. Johnson stumbled over a root hidden beneath rotting leaves, catching himself against a tree trunk that left dark stains across his uniform. The jungle floor beneath his boots squelched with moisture that never fully evaporated in the perpetual humidity. His pack frame caught on low-hanging branches, requiring him to duck and twist through spaces that seemed designed for smaller bodies. The irony was not lost on him. They were the most technologically advanced military force in human history, equipped with weapons and communications that previous generations of soldiers could barely imagine. Yet they moved through this environment like mechanized giants stumbling through a world built for different dimensions. Foster signaled for the patrol to resume movement, and the column began its laborious advance through vegetation that seemed to resist their presence. The sound of their passage carried farther than any of them wanted to acknowledge. The distinctive metallic rattle of American military equipment, the heavy footfalls of soldiers carrying loads that exceeded reasonable human endurance, the occasional curse when someone caught their gear on unexpected obstacles. 300 meters to their east, concealed in a spider hole that had taken 2 days to excavate, Nguyen Van Hoa listened to the approaching Americans with something approaching amazement. His entire combat load, AK-47 rifle, 4 magazines of ammunition, water, medical supplies, and 3 days of rice, weighed less than the radio carried by a single American soldier. At 104 pounds, Hoa could move through jungle terrain with the silence of wind through leaves. His weapon weighed 7.9 pounds loaded compared to the 8-pound M16 carried by his enemies. More importantly, the AK-47 fired 600 rounds per minute with legendary reliability in the humid conditions that plagued American weapons. The Vietnamese fighters had spent weeks studying American patrol patterns, learning the rhythms of their movement, the distances they could travel before fatigue forced extended rest periods. What struck Hoa most profoundly was how the Americans' technological advantages had become tactical disadvantages in this environment. Their superior firepower required heavier weapons. Their advanced communications demanded bulky radio equipment. Their logistical supremacy necessitated carrying enough supplies to sustain operations without constant resupply, a luxury the Viet Cong had never possessed and therefore never missed. Sutherland called another halt, studying his map while his Marines took advantage of the break to adjust equipment and catch their breath. The patrol had covered less than 2 kilometers in 3 hours, a pace that would have been embarrassing in training exercises back in California. Here, in terrain that seemed actively hostile to their presence, it represented the maximum sustainable rate of advance for soldiers carrying loads that exceeded the design parameters of human endurance. The captain's radio crackled with updates from other units operating in the province. 2nd Platoon had made contact with suspected Viet Cong positions, but lost them after a brief firefight. 3rd Platoon reported finding recently abandoned camps with evidence of enemy presence, but no actual engagement. The pattern was becoming familiar, glimpses of an enemy that seemed to vanish the moment American forces arrived in strength, leaving behind only the evidence of their presence and the knowledge that they remained nearby, watching, waiting. Johnson shifted his pack again, feeling the shoulder straps cut into muscles, already strained beyond their normal capacity. The weight distribution that had seemed manageable during stateside training became a source of constant discomfort in the humidity and irregular terrain of Southeast Asia. Every piece of equipment served a purpose, but the cumulative effect created a burden that transformed highly trained Marines into slow-moving targets in an environment where speed and stealth determined survival. The patrol resumed its advance, 19 Americans carrying the technological might of the world's most powerful military through jungle that seemed designed to neutralize every advantage their superior resources had provided them. The heat struck at 0600 hours with the intensity of an opened furnace door. Captain Sutherland watched his Marines prepare for another day of patrol, their movements already sluggish despite the early hour. Temperature readings from the previous day had peaked at 98 degrees Fahrenheit with humidity levels that made breathing feel like drowning in slow motion. The weather station at Da Nang reported similar conditions expected for the next 72 hours, a forecast that meant his men would be operating at the edge of human endurance before they even encountered enemy contact. Private Johnson struggled with his pack harness, the nylon straps dark with perspiration that had never fully dried from the previous day's patrol. His uniform clung to his body like a second skin, the fabric designed for durability rather than comfort in tropical conditions. The additional weight of waterlogged equipment added pounds that the manufacturers had never calculated into their load specifications. His boots, rated for temperate climates, had developed a persistent squelch that announced his position with every step through the perpetually damp jungle floor. Sergeant Foster distributed ammunition among his squad, calculating loads that balanced firepower with mobility. Each Marine carried a minimum of 200 rounds for their M16 rifles, plus additional ammunition for crew-served weapons. The ME-60 machine gun required 3 men to transport effectively. Foster carried the gun itself, while 2 others shared the burden of extra barrels, ammunition, and tripod assembly. In theory, this distribution spread the weight evenly across the unit. In practice, it meant that every Marine carried more than his body was designed to sustain in the climate and terrain of Southeast Asia. The psychological impact of their physical burden manifested in ways that training had never addressed. Marines who had excelled in stateside exercises found themselves questioning their capabilities as the weight of their equipment compounded the effects of heat exhaustion. Foster watched men who had never shown weakness struggle with loads that seemed manageable during temperate weather training. The mental toll of constant physical strain was becoming as significant as any enemy action they might encounter. 200 meters south of their position, Lieutenant Le Ju Kwang observed the American preparations through field glasses that weighed less than a single magazine of M16 ammunition. His entire reconnaissance kit, binoculars, maps, compass, notebook, and writing materials added less than 3 pounds to his combat load. He had been tracking this particular Marine patrol for 6 days, studying their movement patterns, rest intervals, and the increasing signs of fatigue that marked their daily operations. Huang's tactical analysis revealed advantages that American military doctrine had never considered. Vietnamese fighters averaged 5 feet 3 inches in height and 104 pounds in weight, dimensions that provided natural concealment in terrain where American Marines stood out like monuments. More significantly, their reduced equipment loads allowed sustained movement at speeds that American forces could not match while carrying their prescribed combat loads. The lieutenant's observations confirmed what Viet Cong commanders had suspected since the American military buildup began. The technological superiority that dominated conventional warfare became a liability in the dense jungle environment of Southeast Asia. American soldiers required constant resupply of ammunition, water, and equipment that Vietnamese fighters produced locally or captured from enemy forces. The logistical tail that supported American operations created vulnerabilities that guerrilla forces could exploit with precision timing and minimal resources. Foster's squad moved out at 0730. Their formation spread across 50 meters of jungle trail that barely qualified as a path. The Marine Corps had trained them for advances across open terrain, where mutual support and coordinated firepower provided tactical advantages. Here, in vegetation so dense that visual contact between squad members required constant effort, their superior equipment became individual burdens rather than collective strength. The strain manifested first in the youngest Marines. Johnson, at 19 years old and 158 pounds, carried a proportionally heavier load than his more experienced squad members. His pack frame, designed for soldiers of average height and weight, distributed pressure across shoulders that had not yet developed the muscle mass necessary for sustained heavy carrying. By 0900 hours, he was falling behind the patrol interval, forcing Foster to call frequent halts that disrupted their tactical rhythm. Captain Sutherland monitored his unit's progress through radio reports that crackled with static interference from the dense canopy overhead. Other patrols in the area reported similar difficulties: movement rates well below operational planning estimates, increased rest requirements, and growing concerns about the sustainability of their current tactical approach. The weight differential between American Marines and Vietnamese fighters was becoming a strategic factor that no amount of firepower superiority could overcome. The psychological effects extended beyond individual performance to unit cohesion. Marines who had trained together for months found themselves unable to maintain the tactical formations that their doctrine required. The physical demands of carrying heavy loads through difficult terrain forced adaptations that compromised their ability to provide mutual support during contact with enemy forces. Squad leaders like Foster faced impossible choices between maintaining prescribed tactical procedures and accommodating the physical limitations of their men. Huang documented these observations in reports that would influence Viet Cong tactical development for the remainder of the conflict. American forces, despite their overwhelming advantages in firepower and technology, were constrained by logistical requirements that made them predictable targets for guerrilla operations. Their heavy equipment loads created noise signatures that could be detected from distances measured in hundreds of meters rather than dozens. Their movement rates were sufficiently slow that Vietnamese fighters could establish ambush positions with time to spare for careful preparation. By mid-morning, Foster's squad had covered less than 1 kilometer from their starting position. The heat index had climbed beyond safe operational limits, forcing mandatory rest periods that consumed tactical time while providing minimal physical relief. Marines who had excelled in temperate climate training found themselves struggling with environmental conditions that their Vietnamese counterparts had adapted to since childhood. The burden of American technological superiority was revealing itself as a tactical liability that no amount of training or motivation could overcome. Foster watched his Marines struggle with equipment loads that exceeded human carrying capacity in tropical conditions, while somewhere in the jungle around them, Vietnamese fighters moved with the silence and speed that their reduced equipment loads made possible. The weight differential was becoming the determining factor in a conflict where mobility and stealth mattered more than firepower and technology. The Bell UH-1. Huey descended through morning mist toward landing zone Bravo, its twin turbine engines generating 1,100 shaft horsepower to lift a maximum payload of 4,000 pounds. Captain Sutherland counted 13 Marines in the cargo bay, each carrying combat loads that had been reduced by executive decision from division headquarters. The new tactical directive, implemented across all units operating in the Siege Corps tactical zone, mandated equipment modifications based on field observations that could no longer be ignored by senior command. Private Johnson's pack now weighed 78 pounds instead of the previous 123, a reduction achieved through elimination of non-essential equipment and adoption of lightweight alternatives developed specifically for jungle operations. His M16 rifle remained standard issue, but ammunition loads had been reduced from 200 rounds to 120, with the difference made up through more frequent resupply operations conducted by helicopter rather than ground convoy. The Huey touched down with practiced precision, its crew chief already counting seconds until takeoff. Maximum ground time in hostile territory was limited to 30 seconds for administrative landings, 90 seconds for medical evacuations. The pilot, Warrant Officer 3rd Class David Martinez, had flown 147 combat missions since arriving in country 8 months earlier. His aircraft carried armor plating that added 400 pounds to its empty weight, but provided protection against small arms fire up to 7.62 millimeter caliber. Sergeant Foster supervised the rapid unloading of his squad, their movements noticeably quicker than previous operations. The weight reduction had improved tactical mobility by approximately 30%, based on field measurements conducted during recent training exercises. More significantly, the psychological impact of carrying manageable loads had restored confidence levels that had been eroding under the burden of excessive equipment weight. The helicopter lifted off with a cargo of wounded Marines from 2nd Battalion, their injuries sustained during contact with Viet Cong forces 48 hours earlier. The enemy tactics had evolved to exploit American vulnerabilities identified through months of tactical observation. Ambush sites were selected specifically to target heavy American patrols struggling with mobility limitations imposed by their equipment loads. The pattern had become predictable enough that Marine Corps tacticians were forced to acknowledge fundamental flaws in their operational approach. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hayes, commanding officer of 1st Battalion 5th Marines, studied casualty reports that reflected the changing nature of combat in Southeast Asia. American losses during the previous quarter exceeded acceptable rates primarily due to inability to pursue fleeing enemy forces after initial contact. Heavy equipment loads that had once provided firepower advantages now prevented effective follow-up operations that could have eliminated Viet Cong units instead of merely forcing their withdrawal. The CH-47 Chinook helicopter that delivered replacement equipment to Firebase, Charlie carried experimental gear designed by contractors who had finally acknowledged the realities of jungle warfare. Lightweight radios reduced communications equipment weight from 20 pounds to 12 pounds, while maintaining transmission ranges adequate for tactical operations. New ammunition designs provided equivalent stopping power with reduced weight per round. Body armor modifications eliminated non-essential components while retaining protection for vital organs. Foster's squad advanced through terrain that had previously required exhausting effort, their improved mobility allowing tactical formations that maintained unit cohesion without compromising individual performance. The M60 machine gun team could now keep pace with rifle squads instead of lagging behind and creating gaps in their defensive coverage. Radio operators maintained communications without the physical strain that had previously degraded their effectiveness as patrol members. The M113 armored personnel carrier waited at grid coordinates that had been impossible to reach during previous operations conducted on foot. Its aluminum armor provided protection against small arms fire, while its tracked configuration allowed movement through terrain that wheeled vehicles could not navigate. Maximum passenger capacity was 11 combat-loaded soldiers, but the reduced equipment weights meant that full squad strength could be transported without exceeding weight limitations that affected vehicle performance. Captain Sutherland coordinated with artillery support located at Firebase Alpha, 6 kilometers southeast of their current position. The M105 howitzers could deliver high explosive rounds with accuracy sufficient to support infantry operations at danger-close distances measured in meters rather than hundreds of meters. Response times had improved from 15 minutes to 6 minutes through employment of pre-positioned ammunition and improved communications procedures developed specifically for rapid reaction missions. The tactical changes reflected lessons learned through painful experience rather than theoretical analysis conducted in climate-controlled facilities. Marine Corps doctrine was being rewritten based on field reports that documented the failure of conventional approaches when applied to unconventional warfare conducted in environments that negated traditional advantages. Equipment manufacturers were forced to acknowledge that their designs had been optimized for conflicts that bore no resemblance to the realities of jungle warfare against guerrilla forces. Private Johnson's confidence had returned with his ability to move effectively through terrain that had previously exhausted him before contact with enemy forces occurred. The psychological impact of manageable equipment loads extended beyond individual performance to unit morale and tactical effectiveness. Marines who had questioned their capabilities under impossible burdens now approached operations with restored faith in their training and equipment. The Bell AH-1 Cobra gunship that provided overhead support carried a 20mm cannon and 76 2.75-inch rockets, delivering firepower that could suppress enemy positions while ground forces maneuvered for advantage. Its maximum speed of 173 miles per hour allowed rapid response to contact reports from multiple units operating across the battalion area of operations. The aircraft's slim profile and armor protection made it nearly invulnerable to small arms fire that posed constant threats to slower, less protected helicopters. Foster observed the difference in his Marines' performance as they conducted sweeps through villages that had previously required exhausting approaches conducted at speeds that telegraphed their intentions to observing enemy forces. Their improved mobility allowed unexpected approaches that caught Viet Cong units unprepared for contact with American forces capable of rapid movement and sustained operations. The tactical advantage had shifted toward units that could adapt their equipment to environmental requirements rather than forcing environmental adaptation to equipment limitations. The changes came too late for Marines who had already paid the price for tactical approaches that ignored the realities of jungle warfare conducted against opponents who understood their environment better than their enemies understood their technology. But for units still conducting operations in Southeast Asia, the adaptations represented acknowledgement that successful tactics required harmony between equipment capabilities and environmental demands, rather than the imposition of technological solutions on tactical problems that required different approaches. The morning sun filtered through Venetian blinds in Captain James Sutherland's study, casting parallel shadows across photographs that documented a war that had ended 47 years earlier. At 73 years old, He moved with the careful deliberation of a man whose knees remembered carrying loads that exceeded human design specifications through terrain that had tested every assumption about modern warfare. His granddaughter Sarah, 22 years old and working on her master's thesis in military history, adjusted her recording equipment while reviewing questions that had taken her 3 months to formulate. Sutherland lifted a black and white photograph showing Marines in full combat gear during a patrol near Quang Tri in 1967. The image captured 19 young men carrying equipment loads that averaged 115 pounds per person, weights that had been reduced from earlier mission requirements but still exceeded sustainable carrying capacity in tropical conditions. He had commanded those Marines through 13 months of combat operations that taught lessons no training manual had anticipated. The weight differential had been more than a tactical consideration. It had been a fundamental shift in how warfare was conducted when environmental factors mattered more than technological advantages. Sarah's research focused on decision-making processes that led to equipment modifications. But Sutherland knew the real story lay in the psychological impact of physical limitations that no amount of motivation could overcome. Marines who had excelled in every aspect of their training found themselves struggling with burdens that made effective combat operations nearly impossible. The photograph triggered memories of specific moments when the consequences of equipment weight had determined tactical outcomes. During an ambush near Firebase Alpha in October 1967, his platoon had made contact with Viet Cong forces at a range of 60 meters. The enemy fighters had withdrawn after a brief firefight, but his Marines were unable to pursue effectively because their equipment loads prevented the rapid movement necessary for successful follow-up operations. The tactical opportunity was lost not through lack of courage or training, but through physical limitations, imposed by carrying loads that exceeded human endurance. Sarah asked about the decision-making process that led to equipment modifications implemented during the later stages of the war. Sutherland explained that changes came through field reports that documented failure rates among units carrying standard loads versus modified equipment configurations. The data was undeniable. Marines carrying reduced loads experienced 30% fewer heat casualties, 40% improvement in movement rates, and 50% better performance during sustained operations lasting more than 6 hours. The modifications had required overcoming institutional resistance from supply officers who questioned deviations from established procedures, and senior commanders who viewed equipment reductions as compromising combat effectiveness. The breakthrough came when field commanders like Sutherland submitted detailed after-action reports that correlated equipment weight with mission success rates. Units carrying reduced loads completed assigned missions at significantly higher rates than those following standard loading procedures. Sutherland described the psychological transformation that occurred when his Marines were allowed to carry manageable equipment loads. Confidence returned to men who had begun questioning their physical capabilities under impossible burdens. Unit cohesion improved when squad members could maintain tactical formations without struggling to keep pace with their assigned positions. Morale increased dramatically when Marines realized their equipment was designed to enhance rather than hinder their combat effectiveness. The lessons learned extended beyond individual unit performance to strategic considerations that influenced American military doctrine for subsequent conflicts. The Vietnam experience demonstrated that technological superiority meant nothing if soldiers could not employ their equipment effectively in the environmental conditions where they were required to fight. Equipment design had to consider human factors as carefully as technical specifications. Sarah's questions focused on the broader implications of the weight differential between American and Vietnamese forces. Sutherland acknowledged that enemy fighters' advantage in mobility and stealth had been underestimated by American military planners who assumed superior firepower would compensate for tactical disadvantages. The reality was that warfare in dense jungle terrain favored forces that could move quickly and quietly rather than those carrying maximum ammunition and equipment loads. The captain pulled out a field manual dated 1971 that incorporated lessons learned from the weight reduction experiments conducted during his deployment. New loading standards reduced basic combat loads by an average of 35 pounds per Marine while maintaining firepower through improved resupply procedures and more efficient equipment designs. The changes represented acknowledgement that previous approaches had been based on assumptions about warfare that did not apply to the environmental and tactical conditions encountered in Southeast Asia. He described meeting former enemy commanders during a Veterans Reconciliation Conference in Ho Chi Minh City 15 years after the war's conclusion. Vietnamese officers confirmed that American equipment loads had been a significant factor in their tactical planning. Ambush sites were selected specifically to exploit the mobility limitations of heavily loaded American patrols. The predictable movement rates of American units allowed careful preparation of positions that maximized the effectiveness of lighter, more mobile Vietnamese forces. The conversation turned to the personal cost of lessons learned through experience rather than foresight. Marines who served during the early period of heavy equipment loads suffered casualties that might have been prevented if tactical adaptations had been implemented earlier. The bureaucratic resistance to field-initiated changes had prolonged the use of equipment configurations that placed American soldiers at tactical disadvantages that alert enemies could exploit. Sutherland emphasized that the weight differential represented more than a technical problem requiring engineering solutions. It symbolized the broader challenge of adapting military doctrine developed for conventional warfare to the realities of counterinsurgency operations conducted in environments that negated traditional advantages. Success required acknowledgement that enemy capabilities might be better suited to specific tactical conditions than American technological superiority. The interview concluded with Sutherland's reflection that the most important lesson from Vietnam was the need for tactical flexibility when environmental factors created advantages for opponents who understood their terrain better than invading forces understood their technology. The 60-pound weight differential between American Marines and Vietnamese soldiers had been a symbol of deeper issues in military planning that assumed technological solutions could overcome any tactical challenge. The reality was that effective warfare required harmony between equipment capabilities, environmental conditions, and human limitations rather than the imposition of technological advantages that created tactical disadvantages under specific operational circumstances.